Are you seriously saying you've never done this before?
He stole me during my wedding ceremony. In the midst of shattering glass and muffled screams, Alessandro Mancini reached out and tore me from the altar as if my fate belonged to him. Now, in the shadows of the lakeside mansion, his body covered mine like a warm, inescapable shadow. His lips slid slowly down my neck, tracing silent trails of fire with a slowness that felt like music and damnation all at once. I shouldn't crave the touch of the man who kidnapped me on my own wedding day, but he was good, dangerously good. Then he stopped. He lifted his face, his dark eyes piercing into mine, and whispered in a rough, deep voice, "Are you still a virgin?" I'd kept that secret like a sin, and the moment the truth escaped my lips, everything between us would shatter or become eternal. Hi, I'm Lena, and this story is just beginning. Chapter 1. The Worst Day of My Life. The veil was crooked. I'd known this for 20 minutes and couldn't bring myself to care enough to do anything about it. I kept staring at the mirror in the antechamber of St. Patrick's Church, a heavy, gilded mirror, the kind that seems to have opinions about the people who look into it, and thinking there was something deeply revealing about the fact that I was about to marry a man I barely knew, and my biggest concern was a veil tilted slightly to the left. "You look like you're heading to an execution," said Petra, my cousin and maid of honor, appearing behind me in the mirror with the bouquet in her hand and the expression of someone who has absolutely no concept of a filter. She was 25, dark hair cut to her chin, with the unique ability to say exactly what no one should say, always at the worst possible moment. A bouquet of white chrysanthemums. Seriously, Julia, chrysanthemums are funeral flowers in half of Europe. Who chose this? The groom, I replied. Figures. She tossed the bouquet onto the armchair beside her like it had done something personal. That's a sign. Multiple signs, actually. An official statement from the universe. She peered through the cracked door leading to the side hallway, stayed silent for 2 seconds, and added, "The priest is sweating way too much for someone who's just standing there. Either that or he's drunk. Hard to tell. Petra, I'm just observing." She closed the door and faced me with that expression she used when she was about to say something I wasn't going to want to hear. "Speaking of observing, have you noticed that Dario Dragna never looks at you when he's talking to you? He looks at the space next to your head, like you're a detail in a painting he's analyzing." I didn't answer because she was right, and answering would confirm it out loud, and I wasn't ready yet for what would come after that confirmation. "You can still go out the back door," she said, in a tone that made it clear she was being serious. "I've got the car around the corner. I'll shove this dress through the window and we're gone, and leave my father with no way out. Your father put you in this situation, Julia. I knew that. The problem was that knowing something and being able to act on it are completely separate abilities, and I'd never been good at the second one." I looked away from the mirror and glanced through the narrow window facing the side of the church. October in Chicago had that specific quality of light, golden, cold, and fast, as if the sun knew it didn't have much time before winter arrived and took over everything. Outside, guests' cars were still arriving. 200 people I barely knew, dressed for a wedding I'd agreed to in order to pay off a debt that wasn't mine. My father, Lenny Voss, had gone bankrupt 2 years earlier. Not discreetly, spectacularly, with lawsuits, foreclosed properties, and an impressive number of people who suddenly stopped answering the phone. Dario Dragna, a 38-year-old Sicilian man, wealthy with that kind of wealth that has no clean explanation, had bought the debt. And then he'd bought the solution, me. My father had presented it as an opportunity. I'd presented it to myself as a choice, the only one left. "Give me the bouquet," I said. Petra handed me the chrysanthemums with the solemnity of someone handing over a weapon in a duel. I took them, straightened the veil in the mirror, took a deep breath once, the kind of breath that doesn't help at all, but gives the illusion of control, and told myself it would pass, that everything would pass. The organ music began. The ceremony was exactly what I expected, long, formal, and strange as a fever dream. Dario Dragna stood at the altar with the expression of someone who'd bought a property and was satisfied with the acquisition. Neatly combed dark hair, tailored suit, eyes that had never seemed warm to me, not even when he smiled, which was rare. I walked down the center aisle with my father beside me, looking straight ahead and at no one. Because if I looked at the guests' faces, I'd remember that there were 200 people witnessing the moment I formalized the sale of myself for someone else's debt. The priest began speaking in Latin. Dario looked at me, at the space next to my head, like Petra had said, and I realized for the first time that she was right. I looked at the stained glass above the altar, St. George and the dragon, the saint with his lance raised, and the monster at his feet, and thought there was something deeply ironic about getting married beneath an image of combat when I didn't even know what I was fighting against. "Do you take Dario Dragna as your lawful husband?" the priest began, and that was the exact moment the main door's windows exploded inward. The sound was sharp, loud, instantaneous, not a continuous noise, but a brief detonation that made the air tremble inside the nave. Guests rose to their feet. Someone screamed. 2 more shots from outside, not in the church, but close enough that there was no doubt what they were. The priest stepped back. Dario raised his hand in a gesture to his men, and 4 of them emerged from among the guests, with weapons that shouldn't have been inside a Catholic church on a Saturday afternoon. I should have run, should have thrown myself to the floor, or gone in the opposite direction, or done any of the things people in dangerous situations do when survival instinct is faster than thought. Instead, I stood frozen, the bouquet of chrysanthemums still in my hand, the veil slightly crooked, and stared at the front door. It opened slowly, not urgently, not with the violence of someone invading, with the calm of someone who knows the door will open because he decided it would open. The man who entered was in his early 30s, dark hair, black suit with no tie, and an expression I couldn't immediately classify. It wasn't anger, wasn't arrogance, wasn't exactly coldness. It was the expression of someone who'd come to settle a matter and was simply checking off the steps. He walked down the center aisle as if the 200 panicking guests and Dario's 4 armed men were set decoration. He stopped 3 meters from the altar, looked at Dario for 2 seconds, 2 seconds that seemed to last much longer than that, with an indifference so complete it was almost an assault. Then he looked at me and extended his hand. "Let's go," he said in a low voice. Only for me. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a command in the way commands usually sound. Loud, aggressive, full of urgency. It was a certainty, as if the only variable was how long it would take me to agree with what he'd already decided. I looked at Dario. He was motionless, surrounded by the stranger's men with guns pointed at his captains, blocking every exit with a precision that required planning. The expression on Dario's face wasn't fear. It was something I'd never seen in him before. Humiliation. The humiliation of someone being defeated in front of everyone who should respect him, and who can't do anything about it. I understood then, in that second, that Dario wasn't motionless for lack of options. He was motionless because acting would cost more than anything he was willing to lose at that moment. I looked back at the hand extended in front of me and placed mine in it. Behind me, I heard Petra scream my name, not with the desperation of someone calling for help, with Petra's specific desperation, which is a mix of real concern and indignation at the fact that the situation had escaped her control. I turned my head enough to see one of the stranger's men gently guiding her toward the side exit. No violence, no raised weapon, but with the firmness of someone who isn't asking. "Julia!" she screamed again. I looked at her once, just once. The man beside me didn't stop. In the car, a black SUV with tinted windows, leather interior, completely silent inside, I realized I was still holding the bouquet of chrysanthemums. I dropped it on the seat beside me like it had done something wrong. The man sitting to my left looked at the bouquet, then at me, and said nothing. The driver pulled away. The streets of Chicago passed by the window with that October light that hadn't changed. Golden, cold, completely oblivious to the fact that I'd just been stolen from my own altar. "What's your name?" I asked. "Alessandro Mancini." I let the name land. Alessandro Mancini. It meant nothing to me, which probably said everything about how little I knew of the world I'd just entered. I rolled my eyes, because the entire universe had conspired to put me in an armored SUV with a mobster, and I didn't even know his name until 10 seconds ago. "Is there Wi-Fi at the mansion?" I asked. He turned slowly, very slowly, with the expression of someone recalibrating something internally, not with anger, not exactly with surprise, but with that kind of attention a person gives to an object that didn't behave as expected, as if I were a calculation that had yielded the wrong result, and he was deciding whether the problem was in the formula or the data. "There is," he said, after a second. "Great," I replied, and looked out the window. The mansion sat on the shores of Lake Michigan, far enough that the noise of Chicago arrived as an echo. It was large in the way things built, with old money are large, not ostentatious, but inevitable, as if size were merely a natural consequence of everything that had accumulated there over decades. Alessandro showed me the room on the 2nd floor, spacious, with a window facing the lake, sheets that clearly weren't from a supermarket shelf, and a bathroom bigger than my living room. He stayed at the door while I crossed the room and looked around, and then said, "You're not a prisoner here." I turned. "The door won't be locked," he continued, in that same neutral tone that seemed to be his voice's natural state. "But the property grounds have security. If you leave without warning, my men will find you before you reach the gate. That's technically the definition of being a prisoner. It's the definition of being protected," he corrected, without changing his expression. "There's a difference." I wanted to argue that, wanted to say the distinction was convenient for whoever defines the terms. But he'd already left, without locking the door, as he'd promised, without another word, and I was alone in the room with the veil still crooked and the wedding dress that hadn't made it to the end of the ceremony it was made for. I thought about leaving, genuinely thought about it, calculated the distance to the gate, the probability of finding a car on the street beyond, how long it would take to call Petra and ask her to come. And then I thought about Dario Dragna, motionless at the altar, with that cold, dangerous humiliation on his face, humiliated in front of 200 guests, in front of allies, rivals, captains, a man with money and power and armed men, reduced to standing still while his bride walked out in an enemy's arms. That man, I knew without needing experience in the Mafia, wouldn't let this go. Sael, Alessandro's right hand, 30 years old, with a permanently neutral expression I still hadn't managed to decipher, opened the bedroom door without knocking, which under normal circumstances I would have considered rude, but in that context, just seemed like one more item on a long list of things that were different in here. "There's something you need to see," he said. He took me to a room downstairs where there was a row of monitors showing live feeds from the exterior cameras. The property, the gate, the street beyond the wall. 2 black cars were circling the block, slow, unhurried. The way things move when they don't need to hurry because they're just waiting for the right moment. "They're Dragnas," Sal said, with the neutrality of someone reporting the weather. I looked at the cars on the screen, at the block, at the wall that stood between them and the place where I was now. I thought about Dario at the altar. I thought about walking out the gate alone, in a wedding dress, onto a Chicago street where 2 Dragna cars were making rounds, and I understood, with that inconvenient clarity that appears when you can no longer fool yourself, that the decision to stay hadn't been emotional. It had been the only decision a person with any intention of staying alive could make, for now. Chapter 2: Prisoner in Luxury. The rules of that place weren't written anywhere, which meant I needed to discover them through elimination. I spent the first few days doing this methodically. I'd wake up, have coffee, circulate through the rooms accessible to me, living room, library, balcony, side garden, and mapped what was allowed by what no one came to stop me from doing. No one followed me through the hallways. No one took books from my hands. No one told me where to sit, when to eat, or who to talk to. The mansion operated with a silent, efficient logic that took me 3 days to understand. There were no bars because bars weren't necessary. The perimeter was out there. In here, freedom was real, just geographically limited. Sale appeared every morning with a tray of coffee, bread, and fruit, knocked twice on the door and came in before I answered, which I'd decided to interpret as efficiency rather than rudeness. He'd set down the tray, say, "Good morning, miss," with the neutral expression of a man who'd processed every possible situation in life and concluded that none of them merited a visible reaction, and leave, every morning, without variation, like a weather phenomenon. Alessandro appeared at meals. Not all of them, some of them, which was, I quickly discovered, much worse than appearing at all of them, because at least then I could prepare myself. The way it was, I never knew when he'd be sitting at the table when I came downstairs, and there was something disturbing about the fact that I'd started paying attention to it. It was at the 5th meal that the war of words really began. I'd come down for lunch with 0 expectations, and found him already seated, with a folded newspaper beside his plate, and a cup of coffee that clearly wasn't his first of the day. I sat on the opposite side of the table, long enough that it didn't seem like a deliberate gesture, though it was, and picked up the menu Sael had left. "Did you sleep well?" Alessandro asked without looking up from the paper. "Define well." He looked up, slowly, like someone finishing reading a line before bothering to look up. "More than 4 hours without abrupt waking usually counts." "Then yes," I replied. "If that's the criterion, I've slept well most of my adult life, including the nights before unwanted weddings." He lowered the paper 1 centimeter, not 2. 1, just enough for his eyes to appear above the fold. There was something in that look I still hadn't managed to catalog precisely. It wasn't exactly curiosity, wasn't exactly amusement, but it was something between the two that he clearly wasn't distributing to everyone. "Unwanted," he repeated. "You think I wanted to marry Dario Dragna?" "I think," he said, carefully folding the newspaper and placing it beside his plate, "that you could have gone out the back door at any point before the ceremony started, and you didn't." I stared at him for a second. That was irritatingly accurate. "There were circumstances," I said. "There always are." He picked up his coffee cup. "The question is, which circumstances you choose to honor. I didn't answer because I didn't have a response that wouldn't confirm his argument, and giving Alessandro Mancini the satisfaction of being right on a Monday morning seemed like a bad precedent for the entire period of forced cohabitation still to come. He knew I'd given up on answering. I knew he knew, and he drank his coffee with the calm of a man completely comfortable with silence, which was, I realized, a huge advantage in a conversation. I was going to need to work on that. Petra's voice message arrived Thursday at 11 in the morning, lasting 4 minutes and 32 seconds. I was in the library when my phone buzzed. Alessandro had returned the device on the second day, without comment, which I'd interpreted as a gesture that said more about confidence in the perimeter than generosity, and I put in my earbuds before hitting play, because the thumbnail already showed Petra's expression in the profile photo, and I knew I'd need privacy. Julia, are you okay? I went to the police station. They said there was no kidnapping report, so I went to another police station, and they said the same thing, which clearly means someone paid someone off, so I went to, pause, sound of deep breathing. Okay, calm. I'm calm. So, your mom called. I told her you were fine, and she asked if you'd gotten married before disappearing. I said not exactly. She went silent for 10 seconds and hung up, which honestly is the most sensible reaction she's ever had. Your father. Another pause. Longer. Your father is fine. Physically, in the sense that he's standing and breathing and has no visible injuries, so, Julia, I need to know you're okay. Not okay like, I'm not bleeding, but okay like, I'm okay. Can you send a message? A word? An emoji? Anything that, pause. Are you okay? Because if you are, and I need you to be, I need you to tell me everything, with details. Was the guy hot? Because from the angle I saw from the side exit, he looked hot. Julia. Message. Now. I stared at the library ceiling for a moment, after the message ended. There was something deeply comforting about the fact that Petra, in the middle of a scenario that included gunshots, kidnapping, and wedding collapse, had organically arrived at the question about the perpetrator's physical appearance. I sent a message. I'm fine. Details soon. He is hot, which makes everything more complicated. She responded in 40 seconds with another 2-minute voice message I decided to listen to later. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, almost 2 weeks after my arrival, that I found my camera bag. It was in the bedroom, leaning against the wall next to the closet, exactly where someone had carefully placed it. I'd brought it on my wedding day because I'd come straight from work. I'd photographed a corporate meeting the night before, and hadn't had time to stop by the house, and in the chaos of the sacristy, I'd left it propped in a corner, without thinking about it again. I picked up the bag and checked the contents out of habit. The 2 cameras, the lenses, the memory cards, the charger, everything in place. I closed the zippers, breathed. There was something about work instruments that normalized any environment, no matter how strange, and took the bag to the balcony. Photographing the lake became routine during those days. It was the only thing I did that felt completely mine, without any layer of that place on top of it. I didn't notice then that the outer side pocket had been opened and closed before me. Fen Caruso arrived at the mansion that same afternoon. I saw him from the garden, a man in his mid-40s, graying hair, dark gray suit, with that walk of someone who'd never arrived anywhere without being expected. I didn't know yet who he was, but Sale received him at the door with the silent familiarity of someone who doesn't need to ask the name or reason, which, in that universe, was already a form of introduction. Fen Caruso, I would discover, was Alessandro's counselor, the man who arrived when decisions had already been made and just needed execution. The 2 disappeared into the interior of the house without ceremony. What caught my attention wasn't the arrival. It was how long Fen stayed. 2 hours. I counted unintentionally because I was on the balcony when he came in and still on the balcony when he left, with the same composure as before and the same steady stride. But there was something different about how Alessandro appeared in the garden a few minutes later, standing near the stone balustrade, looking at the lake with his hands in his pockets and a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there in the morning. I didn't ask. It wasn't my business, or at least that's what I told myself, but I watched him longer than I should have. It was that same night that the window scene happened. I was on the 2nd floor, trying to photograph the lake with the light left after sunset, that specific blue-gray of October in Chicago that requires patience to be captured correctly. I adjusted the aperture, changed the angle, stepped back 2 paces, moved forward 1, with that concentration that makes the rest of the environment disappear. Then I realized I wasn't alone. There was no sound, no footsteps, no audible movement. It was the presence, before anything else. The warmth of someone too close, or a displacement of air, or some sense I didn't know I had until that moment. I turned, shoulders raised, ready for something that in the end wasn't necessary. Alessandro was standing less than a meter away, looking at the camera screen I still held at chest height. He hadn't announced his arrival, hadn't asked permission. He stood with that silent naturalness of someone accustomed to occupying spaces without asking permission, not with aggression, but with the calm certainty of someone who'd never needed to announce himself to be noticed. I should have said something, should have stepped back, or made some sarcastic comment that re-established the appropriate distance between kidnapped and kidnapper. Instead, I stood frozen while he looked at the images on the screen. The lake, the horizon line slightly below center, the reflection of light on the window glass included in the frame instead of cropped out. The silence lasted longer than it should have. "You see what most people don't see," he said in a low voice. It wasn't exactly a compliment, wasn't exactly analysis. It was an observation, the kind that escapes before someone decides whether it should be said, as if he'd thought it at some earlier moment, and the phrase had found its way out on its own. I didn't know what to do with that, didn't know what to do with the tone, with the proximity, with the fact that he'd been looking at my photos in silence, long enough to have formed an opinion. I stared at him for a second, and he was looking back at me, with that attention that wasn't exactly curiosity and wasn't exactly interest, but was something I didn't feel prepared to name. He left before either of us needed to find what came after that. I lowered the camera and stared at the lake for a considerable time, thinking there was something very inconvenient about living in the same house as a man who could destabilize me with an 8-word sentence, and who left before I had a chance to recover. The next day, Alessandro appeared at breakfast with that expression of someone who'd made a decision during the night. He said nothing, but there was something different in the way he looked at me when I entered the room, less calculated, more attentive, as if I'd shifted from variable to problem, and he was still deciding what to do with the difference. I didn't know what had changed, I only knew it had. Chapter 3: The Problem of Being Too Close. Alessandro called me to the office on a Monday morning, at the start of the 4th week. It wasn't Sale who came to get me. It was him. He knocked on the bedroom door, 2 raps, and when I opened it, he was leaning against the doorframe with that posture I'd already learned to identify as, "I have something to say, and I've calculated all the ways to say it before coming here." It wasn't tension, it was precision. The difference between the two, I'd realized over those weeks, was one of his trademarks. "When you have a moment," he said. "I have several. I'm a prisoner." One corner of his mouth moved, almost. Office, 5 minutes. The office was on the 1st floor. At the end of the hallway I still hadn't fully explored. It was a room that seemed like a direct extension of the man who occupied it. Dark, organized, without a single object that didn't have a function. Bookshelves covering an entire wall, heavy oak desk, 2 chairs on the opposite side. No photographs, no decorative details that revealed anything beyond the essential. I sat. He remained standing, which was a power move I noticed but decided not to comment on. "There's something inside your camera bag you need to know about," he said. I stared at him. "The external hard drive you used at that corporate meeting," Alessandro continued, in that neutral tone that didn't make things less heavy, just more inevitable. "The photos from the automatic backup. You photographed more than a business meeting that night." He opened the laptop on the desk and turned the screen toward me. I recognized the setting immediately. The warehouse at the port, the industrial lighting, the long tables with documents and the boxes in the background. I'd photographed it thinking it was exactly what I'd been hired to photograph. Executives in a meeting, the kind of formal corporate record some companies use for visual minutes. I'd done the job, left, done the backup in the car before getting home. Then the screen advanced to the next image. I'd captured, without realizing it, the moment someone opened one of the boxes in the background. With the quality the telephoto lens delivered even at a distance, the contents were legible with uncomfortable clarity. Rifles, tactical vests with markings that weren't civilian, pistols packed in black foam. And around the table, faces I'd recorded without knowing who they were, until Alessandro swiped to the next image, and I saw Dario Dragna in profile, with 2 men beside him I didn't know, and 2 more I knew from newspaper photos because they were federal senators who'd given speeches about combating organized crime in prime time. I stared at the screen for a time I couldn't measure. "I didn't know," I said finally. It was obvious, but it needed to be said. "I know," Alessandro replied. "I was hired to photograph a business meeting. They sent me the address, told me the time. I went, photographed what was there to photograph, and left." I heard my own voice and realized I was organizing the facts out loud, less for him and more for myself, trying to fit the pieces into an order that made sense. "I was carrying this with me and didn't even know it. And you went to the wedding directly from work," Alessandro said, without stopping at home. The realization fell slowly, and with weight. The bag in the sacristy, the hard drive inside the bag, Dario Dragna at the altar, 30 meters from evidence that could destroy him, with no idea it was there. I'd had no idea either. What does this mean? I asked, and the question was broader than the words. Alessandro closed the laptop. It means you accidentally photographed enough to incriminate Dario Dragna, 2 Dragna family captains, and 2 federal senators for illegal arms trafficking. He spoke slowly, without drama, like someone giving coordinates. And it means that as long as this hard drive exists with your name attached to it, even if you don't know what's on it, you're a problem the Dragnas need to resolve. The silence that came after that had texture. That's why you're still keeping me here, I said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a conclusion. Partially, he replied. And there was something in that. Partially, I didn't know if I wanted to examine more closely. The next day, Sale took me to my apartment. The idea had been mine. I needed clothes, equipment, things that were mine, and that were in a place that continued to exist, even though my entire life had changed addresses in the last few weeks. Alessandro had authorized it with one condition. Sael would go along, and the route would be determined by him, not by me. I'd agreed because it was reasonable, and because reasonable had become my new criterion for decisions, given the environment. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Cameras on the charger, plants slightly dried out, the coffee cup from the morning of the wedding still in the sink because I'd left in a hurry, and it had become an involuntary time capsule. I grabbed what I needed quickly, because Sale had said they had 30 minutes, and his tone when establishing deadlines didn't invite negotiation. On the way back, about 15 minutes from the mansion, the car stopped at a light, and 2 vehicles boxed in the SUV from both sides at the same time. Sale reacted before I understood what was happening, accelerated through the light, turned onto a side street, spoke rapidly on the phone in Italian. I turned to the rear window and saw the 2 cars trying to keep pace, then saw one of them crash into the side of a parked vehicle and lose speed. The second pursued for 2 more blocks before giving up. The SUV stopped in a closed garage that Sale accessed with a code. He turned off the engine, stayed silent for exactly 3 seconds, and then said, "Are you all right, miss?" I was, physically, completely unharmed. But there was something that wasn't exactly fear, and wasn't exactly adrenaline. It was the visceral understanding, installed in the body before passing through thought, that this world was real, that the guns were real, that the men in those cars had a real objective, and I was part of it. "They were Dragnas," I said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Sale replied. "How did they know I'd left?" Sale didn't answer immediately, and that 2-second pause said more than any answer would have. Back at the mansion, Alessandro was at the entrance when we arrived. There was no visible urgency in him. There never was. But there was that quality of concentrated attention I'd learned to distinguish from his neutral state. He looked at me first, then at Sael. Sael made an almost imperceptible gesture with his head, and the 2 exchanged 3 phrases in low Italian before Alessandro turned his eyes back to me. "You're all right," he said. It wasn't a question either, but it was different from Sale's. It was a verification, the kind someone does when the answer matters more than the form. "I am," I replied. He nodded, and then turned to Sale with that expression I'd already learned to recognize as the beginning of something that wasn't going to be simple. I knew in that moment that the question of how the Dragnas had learned of my departure already had an answer, and that the answer was inside this house. The name was Petrov. I learned this that night, not because anyone told me directly, but because the mansion has a specific acoustics when something serious is happening. Footsteps change rhythm, doors close more carefully than normal, and silence acquires a different quality, compressed, like air before a storm. Petrov was the mansion's security assessor, a man of about 40, blonde hair cut close, whom I'd seen a few times in the hallways without anyone introducing him formally. There was something in the way he looked at environments before looking at people that I'd noticed without knowing how to name. Sael had connected 2 points. Petrov was present when the camera bag was found, and he'd made a call to a Dragna number a few hours before the attack on the car. Alessandro confronted him in the meeting room with the evidence in hand. I wasn't there, but Alessandro's voice came down the hallway, low and uniform, without any elevation, which was more frightening than any shout. Petrov tried to negotiate. I heard a fragment. "I can be useful. I know things that." And then Alessandro's silence, which lasted exactly the time necessary to make clear that the negotiation had ended before it began. When Sale left the room a few minutes later with that expression of someone who's been tasked with something and won't comment on the details, I imagined that Alessandro had looked at Petrov the way one looks at something small and inconvenient, Not with anger, not with drama, just with the indifference of someone who's already decided and is waiting for execution to catch up with the decision. Sile resolved the problem. I didn't ask how. I heard a door close downstairs, a heavy door, with that definitive sound of something that won't be reopened, and decided there were questions I didn't need to ask to understand the answers. Alessandro appeared on the balcony where I was later, when the mansion had returned to that silence that was the place's normal state, but that night had a different layer. He was without his jacket, without his composure entirely assembled, and there was something in that detail, the shirt sleeve slightly rolled up, the expression 1 degree less calibrated than usual, that made his presence more real than I was used to processing. He stood beside the balustrade, looking at the garden. I looked at him for a moment, before speaking. "Did you know this was going to happen?" Alessandro turned. He stared at me for a second, and I saw, for the first time since I'd known him, the moment when he didn't have an elegant answer ready. It wasn't exactly hesitation. It was the interval of a man who's weighing words not to manipulate, but because he's being precise about something that matters. "I knew they would react," he said finally. "I didn't calculate it would be this fast. It was a mistake." He was admitting a mistake. To me, out loud, with that precision he applied to everything, without minimizing and without dramatizing, just placing the fact where it was. I didn't know what to do with that for a second, and then I realized he didn't know either, that there was something in the way he looked at me after saying that which suggested that admission had cost more than it seemed, that he was as conscious of the weight of the moment as I was. "It's okay," I said after a while. "Nobody got hurt." He didn't respond, but something relaxed slightly in his shoulders, so slightly that I probably wouldn't have noticed a week earlier. After that night, something changed in the way he moved through the space we shared, not abruptly. Alessandro Mancini didn't do anything abruptly. Everything about him was calculated, gradual, with that timing that seemed natural, but that I was beginning to suspect wasn't. He started appearing at moments when I didn't expect him, not necessarily to talk, sometimes just to be near, with that presence that occupied the environment in a way I felt before I saw. One afternoon, I found a glass of wine on the library table, beside the book I had left open the night before. There was no note, no explanation. Sale, when I passed him in the hallway, had the expression of someone who definitely didn't put any glass of wine anywhere. On another occasion, Alessandro sat on the living room sofa while I was reading, not on the opposite side, where there were available seats, but on the same sofa, at a distance that wasn't close enough to be declared, but was close enough that I felt his warmth and lost the thread of the paragraph I was reading. He stayed there for 20 minutes with his own book, before getting up and leaving without comment. And then, one night when the wind from the lake was beating against the windows, and I'd stayed on the balcony longer than normal just because I couldn't sleep, he appeared beside me with a glass in his hand, and stayed silent for a considerable time before saying, without looking at me, "Matteo liked this view." A pause. "My younger brother, he thought the lake at night looked like a quiet animal." I said nothing. I knew, for some reason I couldn't articulate, that saying anything would be the wrong move, that sentence had reached the surface through some path that didn't pass through the control he applied to everything, and that any response from me could make it retreat to where it had come from. So I stayed silent, and he stayed silent beside me, and the lake below remained quiet, like an animal, exactly as Matteo had said. Only later, already in my room, did I realize that Alessandro had noticed I'd kept that, had seen it in the way he looked at me when I finally came in, a fraction of a second longer than necessary, with that silent examination he did of things that didn't behave as expected. I was becoming dangerously similar to one of those things. Fen Caruso returned to the mansion at the end of the week. This time I was in the living room when he arrived, and this time Alessandro didn't try to isolate the conversation. Fen entered, greeted with that nod of someone who doesn't distribute formalities gratuitously, sat in the chair facing the two of us and said, in his usual low voice, "The senators in the photos were contacted by the Dragnas." Pause. "They're going to try to make the hard drive disappear before it reaches someone who can use it. We have 48 hours to deliver it to the federal prosecutor, or this material disappears forever." The silence that came after was different from all the previous silences in that house. It was the kind that precedes decisions with no way back. Alessandro looked at me, I looked at him, and I understood that the next 48 hours would change more than the Dragnas situation. Chapter 4, 48 Hours. The operation began that same night. I wasn't included in the details, and didn't expect to be. What I knew was enough to understand the gravity. The hard drive needed to reach the federal prosecutor before the dragness made it disappear, and it needed to get there in a way that left no trace of origin. Fen Caruso had a contact in the public prosecutor's office, someone who received evidence without identifying the source, without asking questions, without creating records that could be traced. That's how the Mancini family had operated for years. They never appeared, but they resolved. I understood this sitting in the library, listening to the mansion's discreet movement around me, footsteps that changed rhythm, low voices that stopped when I passed through the hallway, Sale going in and out with that expression of someone executing stages of a plan and having no time for alternative expressions. Alessandro didn't sleep that night. I knew this because the office lights were on when I passed through the hallway at 2 a.m. Unable to sleep, and they were still on when I passed again at 4. I didn't go in, but I stood at the door for a second longer than necessary before continuing on. I went to the library. I stayed there with my phone in hand, waiting for news I didn't know how would arrive, and it arrived at 6:40 the following morning on a Chicago news site, in a headline without drama and without a source name. Sicilian businessman detained on suspicion of arms trafficking and corruption of public officials. Dario Dragna, arrested. I stared at the screen for a long moment, waiting to feel something more complex than what I felt. Relief, perhaps, or residual fear, or the cold satisfaction of someone who saw a threat removed. What came was simpler than any of those things, the feeling that something had ended, and immediately after, the realization that I was still here, that the reason I'd arrived at this mansion had disappeared, and I was still sitting in Alessandro Mancini's library at 6:40 in the morning, with no urgency to leave. I closed the site, put my phone on the table, and stared at the dark hallway leading to the office, where the light was still on. Lenny Voss appeared 2 days later. My father, 55 years old, graying hair, with that permanent expression of a man who's always about to propose a deal, arrived at the mansion gate on a Wednesday afternoon with the confidence of someone who thinks the situation has shifted in his favor. With Dario arrested, the debt that had generated the wedding had lost its owner. Lenny's logic, I would deduce later, was simple. No debt, no groom, no reason for his daughter to stay there. It was time to show up, rescue the situation, and see what was possible to renegotiate with the man keeping her. I was on the stairs when I heard my father's voice in the entrance. I didn't go down immediately. I stood frozen in the middle of the steps, out of sight of whoever was downstairs, and listened. Alessandro received him in the entrance hall. Not in the office, not in the main living room, in the entrance, which was, I'd learned, a declaration of how long that conversation would last. Lenny spoke for maybe 2 minutes. I didn't hear the words clearly, but the tone was what I'd known since childhood. The tone of a proposal, of negotiation, of a man who arrives with prepared arguments and expects to find space to use them. Alessandro responded in 3 sentences. I didn't hear the content. His voice was too low to cross the distance, but I heard the silence that came after, which lasted exactly the time of a man understanding that the conversation had ended before it began. I heard the door open. I heard my father leave. I descended the last steps and entered the entrance hall. Alessandro was standing, his back to the closed door, with his composure intact as always. He looked at me when I entered. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him the debt was settled," Alessandro replied, in that direct tone he used when there was no need for elaboration, that he had nothing to negotiate here, and that you're not anyone's property. A 1-second pause, including mine. I stared at him. There was something in those 3 sentences, in their order, in their precision, and especially in the last one, that I couldn't process immediately, because Alessandro Mancini had taken me from the altar of a man who treated me as an acquisition, had kept me in a mansion for almost 2 months, had controlled every variable around me during that time, and had just told my father that I wasn't anyone's property, including his. "Why did you say that?" I asked in a low voice. Alessandro stared at me for a second. "Because it's true," he said, and he left before I could find a response to that. I went back to the stairs, climbed the first 3 steps, and then stopped because my legs weren't cooperating. I stood there, hand on the railing, thinking it was very inconvenient to be in love with a mobster who'd just defended your autonomy to your own father, while technically still keeping you in a house with armed security on the perimeter. The irony was considerable. With the Dragna threat resolved, the mansion's atmosphere changed. Not abruptly. Nothing about Alessandro Mancini happened abruptly, but there was a perceptible difference. The urgency had left. There were no more closed meetings with Fen at all hours. No more Sael going in and out with a mission-in-progress expression. No more that background tension I'd absorbed without noticing until I felt its absence. What remained was harder to name. 2 adults who'd arrived at this place for reasons that no longer existed, and neither acting to end whatever this was. I thought about leaving. Every day, in the morning, I thought about it. The apartment was there. Petra was there. My life was there, in whatever state it was in, waiting to be resumed. There was nothing keeping me in that mansion anymore except something I refused to examine closely because examining it closely meant making a decision. And then Alessandro would appear at breakfast with that folded newspaper and that cup of coffee and that dry irony that took 3 seconds to identify, and I'd stay one more day. It was on a November night, almost 3 weeks after Dario's arrest, that the seduction reached its peak. I couldn't sleep. I'd tried for an hour, given up, been staring at the ceiling of the bedroom that no longer seemed completely strange, which in itself was enough information about how much I'd settled into this place. I got up, put a cardigan over my pajamas, and went to the second-floor balcony just because I needed air. Alessandro was on the balcony below. I saw him from my position, his silhouette against the darkness of the garden, a glass in his hand, looking at the lake with that stillness he carried even when alone. Without knowing exactly why, I went down. The lower balcony was larger, with a direct view of the water. November's cold was a different kind of cold from October's, drier, more solid, without autumn's humidity. Alessandro heard me arrive. He always heard, but didn't turn immediately. He kept looking at the lake for one more second before looking at me. He said nothing. I didn't either. Then Sale appeared. He emerged through the balcony's side door with 2 plates in hand, something hot, with that smell of Italian cooking I'd learned to associate with the coldest nights in the mansion. Placed the plates on the stone table beside the balustrade with his usual silent efficiency, and left with the expression of a man who definitely hadn't organized anything, hadn't planned anything, and had no opinion about anything that was happening. Alessandro looked at the plates, looked at me. "He does this," I said. "He does," Alessandro confirmed, in that tone that was almost humor, but didn't quite get there. We sat. There was a bottle of wine on the table. I hadn't noticed before, but it was there, already open, as if Sael had predicted that too. Alessandro poured both glasses without asking, and I said nothing because saying anything would break the silence that had settled between us, and that, strangely, I didn't want to break. We ate and drank with that quietness that was no longer uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms between 2 people who no longer need to fill the space between them with words. The cold increased while we ate, and at a certain point, I crossed my arms over my cardigan because I hadn't been smart enough to bring something heavier. I didn't notice when Alessandro's jacket ended up on my shoulders. It wasn't announced, wasn't asked. It was cold, he must have noticed. And the jacket was simply there, heavy and warm, with that smell of him I could have identified with my eyes closed at that point. I looked at him. He was looking at the lake, as if he hadn't done anything worth commenting on. I said nothing. We stayed like that for a while. The lake below, the cold around us, the jacket on my shoulders, and that presence beside me that had become the most familiar and most unsettling thing in my day at the same time. Alessandro turned slightly in his chair toward me. He didn't stand, didn't change position dramatically, just turned enough that the distance between us became different from what it had been a second before. Then he leaned in, slowly, unhurried, with that deliberation he applied to everything, and raised his hand, running his finger along my chin in a light, precise touch that lasted less than 3 seconds, but that I felt in every nerve ending in my body. When he spoke, his voice came out low, with that timing he had for things that knew exactly where to land. "Are you still going to tell me you want to leave?" The garden went quiet. The cold went quiet. I went quiet. And the silence that came after, the silence in which I didn't answer, in which I didn't look away, in which I didn't pull back, was a clearer answer than anything I could have said out loud. He knew it. I knew he knew. I stood slowly, with the jacket still on my shoulders, and went inside without looking back. Not because I wanted to leave, but because if I stayed one more minute on that balcony, I wouldn't be able to go upstairs. I climbed the stairs, entered my room, closed the door, not locking it, just closing it, and stood in the dark for a moment, with Alessandro's jacket still on my shoulders, and my heart at a rhythm that had nothing to do with the physical effort of climbing stairs. Downstairs, on the balcony, he stayed, but we both knew that night hadn't ended. Chapter 5. The Night That Changes. Everything I knew, he would come to my room, not because he'd said so, not because there was some implicit agreement between us. There was nothing implicit between Alessandro Mancini and anyone. Everything about him was calculated and deliberate and exact. But I knew because I'd climbed those stairs with his jacket still on my shoulders, and I hadn't returned it. And neither of us had pretended that was accidental. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Didn't lie down. Didn't turn on any light except the nightstand lamp, which cast a circle of yellow light and left the rest of the room in shadow. I heard the mansion around me, the lake wind against the windows, the specific silence of a large house at night, footsteps in the hallway that I recognized before they stopped outside my door. 2 knocks. I stood, went to the door, opened it. Alessandro was on the other side with the glass still in his hand, empty now. And that expression I'd learned over the last 2 months to read with a precision that frightened me. It wasn't the Don's expression, wasn't the expression of the man who calculated everything before acting. It was the expression of someone who'd calculated, had weighed, and had decided that this time he wouldn't calculate anymore. Neither of us pretended surprise. He came in. It started slowly. That was his way. I would understand this later, when I had enough distance to think clearly, but in that moment, I could only experience it in real time. He placed the glass on the nightstand, with that specific care of someone who doesn't want noise, doesn't want interruption, doesn't want anything that breaks what's forming in the air between the 2 people in the room. He turned, looked at me, and stood still for a second just looking at me, with that attention I'd felt since the first day, that silent examination that wasn't invasive, but that missed nothing, that saw things I hadn't intentionally shown, and that stayed stored in him without comment. Then he took a step toward me, just one, and stood still again, close enough that I felt his warmth, far enough that there was space between us I could or could not cross. It was a question without words. It was the same question he'd asked on the balcony. "Are you still going to tell me you want to leave?" Formulated this time only with the distance between our bodies. I crossed the space. When I moved closer, he raised his hand and touched my face, his palm warm against my cheek, his thumb tracing a slow line from my cheekbone to the corner of my mouth, with a precision that had nothing casual about it. I closed my eyes for a second, just one, because there was something in the way he touched that made it impossible to process anything else at the same time. "Julia," he said, in a low voice, just my name, as if he wanted to verify I was still there, inside that moment, present and conscious and choosing. "I'm here," I replied, and then he kissed me. It wasn't the kind of kiss I'd imagined, and I had imagined it, over the last few weeks, more times than I was willing to admit. There was no excessive urgency, no rush. It was slow and deliberate and deep, with that quality of something being done the way it should be done, and no other way. His hand was still on my face, and the other found my waist, not grabbing, just resting, with a light pressure that somehow weighed more than anything stronger would have weighed. I put my hands on his chest, felt the muscles beneath his shirt, his breathing changing slightly under my palms, and there was something extraordinarily unsettling about discovering that Alessandro Mancini had irregular breathing when he kissed me, that there was something in me that crossed that composure nothing else crossed. He guided me back toward the bed slowly, without interrupting the kiss, without hurry, as if the destination were inevitable and speed were irrelevant. When both our knees met the edge of the mattress, he pulled back 1 centimeter, just 1 centimeter, and looked at me, checking, always checking. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice rougher than normal. "Yes," I replied, and it was true. We lay down. There was something about the way Alessandro moved that made the entire world disappear. He was patient, precise, almost reverent in his stillness. Every movement felt like a deliberate choice, as if he had all the time in the world, and every intention of savoring every second on my body. His hands traveled over my skin with a torturous slowness, nothing rushed, nothing casual. Every touch carried weight and intent. His fingers slid along the contour of my breasts over the thin fabric of the dress, down the curve of my waist, and squeezed my hips lightly, as if he were memorizing every line of my body. I felt the heat of his palm burning through my clothes when he gripped my thigh, slowly parting it to fit himself between my legs. I didn't even realize when my hands gripped the collar of his shirt, my fingers bunching the fabric, pulling him closer as if I needed him just to keep from losing myself. He tilted his head, and his warm breath brushed against my neck, sending goosebumps over my entire body. He didn't say anything at first. He just breathed there, deeply, as if he were intoxicating himself with my scent. Then his lips touched my skin, warm, soft, open. One slow kiss, followed by another, tracing a damp path from the base of my neck to my shoulder. When I felt the slight graze of his teeth, a low moan escaped my throat before I could stop it. My body arched against his by instinct. I felt his hardness pressing between my legs, hot and evident even through our clothes, and it made something inside me tighten with a force that left me breathless, a dangerous mix of desire and nerves. That was when we reached the limit. Alessandro slid his hand under my dress, moving up the inside of my thigh, with that same deliberation. His fingers brushed the edge of my panties, already damp with arousal, and he let out a husky, low sound against my neck. He pressed his open palm against my sex through the fabric, feeling the heat I couldn't hide. His thumb traced a slow, precise circle right where I was throbbing most, making my hips move on their own against his hand. It was at that moment that my entire body locked up. My shoulders went rigid. My breath, which had been coming in ragged gasps, hitched in my chest in a different way, not just from pleasure, but like someone about to cross a line they had never crossed before. My movements hesitated. My legs, which had been open for him, tensed slightly. Alessandro stopped immediately. It wasn't a jarring pullback. It was controlled, deliberate, like everything about him. He pushed himself up just enough to look at my face, propping his weight on his forearm beside my head. His breathing was still heavy, his chest rising and falling fast, his dark eyes glowing with desire, but completely focused on me. The silence between us was thick, heavy. "Julia," he murmured, his voice low and gravelly, barely a whisper against my lips. "Are you still a virgin?" The room seemed to shrink around us. I could have lied. The temptation flashed by, to say no, to pull him back, to let him keep touching me in that way that made my body burn. But those eyes didn't miss a thing. He would see the lie before it even left my mouth, so I didn't lie. I gave an almost imperceptible nod, my eyes downcast, my cheeks burning. I didn't need to say the word. He understood. Alessandro didn't react with shock, or disappointment, or uncomfortable haste. He just looked at me for a long second, processing. Then slowly, he moved his body back just enough for there to be fresh air between us. But he didn't get off me. He was still there, warm, present, the evident bulge in his pants brushing lightly against my thigh, as a silent reminder of the desire he was keeping in check. "It's okay," he said, his voice low and steady, without a single crack. "This doesn't change anything about what I want from you, but it changes how it's going to happen." I swallowed hard, my heart still racing. "What do you mean?" I whispered. He lowered his face until it was only inches from mine, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my knees tremble even while lying down. "It means that when it happens," his voice dropped even lower, deep and heavy with promise, "it will be because you chose it, because you looked me in the eyes and told me without hesitation that you want me. No doubt, no fear, only desire." He brushed his lips against mine, a light touch, almost a tease. "I can wait. I can tease you until you're shaking and desperate for me. I can give you pleasure in every other way, with my hands, with my mouth, until you're trembling and begging me to take you for the first time." Alessandro slid his thumb over my lower lip, his eyes darkening. "But when I am inside you, Julia, it will be because you can't stand to wait any longer, and I am going to make love to you slowly, deeply, and so intensely that you will never forget who was your first." He gave a small, dangerous smile, full of control. "And then, I'm going to do it again, and again, until you forget there was ever a time when I wasn't a part of you." I was left speechless, my entire body pulsing with a mixture of shock, desire, and something much deeper. A man who could have kept going had chosen to stop. Not for lack of desire. I felt how much he wanted me. I saw the fire in his eyes. He stopped because I mattered more than the impulse of the moment. And that choice, that deliberate restraint, was the most erotic and terrifying thing that had ever happened in my life. We stayed together that night, without anything else happening. After Alessandro stopped, after that low, honest conversation, something between us changed in a subtle but profound way. He didn't insist, didn't try to resume what had been interrupted. Instead, he simply pulled me closer, with a gentleness that contrasted with the desire still evident in his body. He adjusted the covers over both of us and lay on his side, draping his arm around my shoulders with calm firmness. I nestled against him, resting my head on his chest. The fabric of his shirt was warm, and I could feel the steady rhythm of his heart, still slightly accelerated, gradually calming down. His arm wrapped around me with soft possessiveness, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my back over my clothes, without pressure, without expectation. There was no rush. Neither of us needed to fill the silence with unnecessary words. We stayed there, close and real, hearing only each other's breathing, and the distant sound of the lake outside, the gentle waves lapping against the shore, the December wind whispering at the mansion's windows. It was a different silence, welcoming, almost sacred. At some point, I couldn't say exactly when, I stopped thinking so much and just started being there. The warmth of his body against mine, the familiar smell of his skin mixed with the fresh night air, the way he held me as if I were something precious and fragile at the same time. All of it enveloped me like a cocoon, and it was exactly there, with my head resting on Alessandro Mancini's chest, feeling the serene rise and fall of his breathing, that the conclusion hit me with crystalline and inevitable clarity. I was in love with this man. It wasn't a realization that came gradually, built slowly. It was like a door that opened suddenly, revealing something that had existed for a long time, just waiting for the right moment to be seen. The certainty settled in my chest all at once, warm and undeniable. Maybe it had started on the balcony of this house, when he looked at me with those intense eyes and made me feel truly seen for the first time. Maybe it had strengthened the day he confronted my father and said, in that calm, firm voice, that I wasn't anyone's property. Or maybe it had deepened that night when he mentioned Matteo in a casual sentence and noticed, without my needing to say anything, that those words had stayed stored in me and respected that space without pressing. Or maybe I'd been in love with him since much earlier, since the moment I took his hand at the altar, without really knowing who he was. And even so, felt that something important had begun. The most beautiful part was realizing that certainty didn't come from the physical desire that had almost consumed us minutes before. It came precisely from what happened after he stopped. It came from the way he chose to respect me, from the patience with which he waited, from the delicacy with which he held me now, without any frustration or demands. A man who could have continued, who clearly wanted me with intensity, decided to place my comfort and my choice above his own desire. That completely disarmed me. I fell asleep with this conclusion settled in my chest, not as a weight, not as something frightening, but as something that had finally found the place where it belonged. His heart beat firm and steady under my cheek, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely safe, desired, and loved, even though no words of love had been spoken yet. And I knew, without any doubt, what that meant for the rest of the choices I would still have to make. I woke before him. December light entered through the window with that cold, horizontal quality of winter mornings in Chicago, without warmth, but with a specific clarity that made everything very sharp. Alessandro was sleeping beside me with his eyes closed and regular breathing, and there was something in that moment, in that single moment when composure was absent, when there was no calculation or control, or that precision he applied to everything, that made him more human than I'd seen in any other instant of the last few weeks. I stared at him for a time I couldn't measure. I thought about everything that had happened since an October Saturday, when I'd entered a church with a crooked veil, not wanting to be there. I thought about Dario Dragna, motionless at the altar. I thought about the SUV, the Wi-Fi, the war of words at meals, the hard drive and the car attack, and Petrov and the 48 hours, and my father being dismissed in 3 sentences, and the jacket on my shoulders without my noticing when it had gotten there. I thought about Matteo, mentioned in a passing sentence on a cold night, and the way Alessandro had stayed silent beside me without asking anything in return for that. And I decided, not with fear, not because I had nowhere to go. I did. The apartment was there, Petra was there, my life was there waiting, not for lack of options. I decided because I wanted to, because there was something in this place, in this morning, in this man sleeping beside me who seemed human without effort for the first and only time, that was worth more than anything I'd left behind. I was staying. I stood there looking at him for a while longer after that. Not because there was anything else to decide, I'd decided, but because there was something in that specific moment, in that man sleeping with his guard completely down for the first and probably only time, that I wanted to keep before he woke, and composure returned to its usual place. Alessandro Mancini sleeping looked like a version of him that only existed when no one was watching. The shoulders loose, the breathing regular, the jawline without that tension of someone who's permanently calculating. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow I hadn't noticed before, too small to be seen from afar, the kind that only appears when you're close enough to see things someone doesn't show on purpose. I didn't ask where it came from. It wasn't the moment for questions. I got up slowly, without making noise, and went to the bathroom to wash my face. I looked at myself in the mirror for a second. The disheveled hair, the expression of someone who slept little but slept well, the cardigan I still somehow had on my body. There was something different about the person looking back at me, and it took me a moment to name it. It was the expression of someone who'd made a decision and wasn't regretful. That, I discovered, was rarer than it should be. That afternoon, I went down to the garden with my camera. It was one of those December days when the lake turned the color of lead, heavy, solid, with that texture of something that holds things inside. I spent time photographing the water's edge, adjusting the framing, letting concentration do what it always did, make the world smaller and more manageable through a lens. That's when I saw Alessandro in the garden. He was standing near the stone balustrade on the opposite side, with the phone to his ear, his back to the mansion. Sale was 2 steps behind, standing, with that posture I'd learned to recognize as a state of alert, not of someone awaiting instruction, but of someone who'd already received bad information, and was waiting for the boss to process it. I stopped photographing. There was something in the position of Alessandro's shoulders I'd never seen before. It wasn't the tension of someone solving a problem. It was different. It was deeper, quieter. The tension of someone who'd just discovered there was a problem that didn't yet have a solution. He spoke too low for me to hear anything, and the call lasted less than a minute. When he hung up, he stood for a second looking at the lake's horizon, at that gray line where the water met the sky, with an expression I couldn't name because I'd never seen it in him before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was the weight of someone who'd received news that changes the entire board and is calculating, in silence, the size of what's coming. Sile said something in a low voice. Alessandro nodded once, briefly, and then he entered the mansion without looking up, without looking at the lake, without looking at me. I stood frozen in the garden with the camera in my hand, looking at the space where he'd been a second before, with that feeling I couldn't name but that I recognized, the feeling of something forming on the horizon before you can see its shape. The Dragnus had fallen. The threat had ended. We were together, or whatever together meant in that world, in that house, between those two people. Everything had been resolved. So why didn't that expression match any of that? I looked again at the gray, heavy lake, its still, dark waters. I remembered Mateo's words, said almost in passing, "It looks like a quiet animal. Quiet animals rarely stay quiet forever." I pressed the camera against my chest, feeling the cold metal against my skin. The wind blew harder, making the dry leaves dance around my feet. For an instant, the garden seemed quieter than it should, and for the first time since I'd arrived there, I felt it clearly. Something was forming on the horizon, something dark, something that didn't have a name yet, but was already beginning to move in our direction. Lena here, that wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. I'd chosen to stay, not because I had to, because I wanted to. I never imagined I'd end up falling in love with the man who stole me from my own altar, in front of 200 guests, without even asking permission. Alessandro Mancini was dangerous, controlled, and elegant in a way that made resisting him a full-time job. And for 2 weeks I thought the worst was over. Then the envelope arrived. A photograph. Me sleeping. Taken from outside the mansion by someone who got in without being seen. Someone wanted me silenced, and he knew it before I did. The question was, would he save me? And was what he felt real enough to survive the price? As you can see, that was just a little taste of book 2. To watch the full uncensored version, just click the first link in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in just a few seconds. Just a reminder, click that first link down in the comments, and the complete book 2, ad-free and uninterrupted, will be waiting for you. It's that simple. I'm absolutely loving working on book 2, and since you guys are loving it too, I promise there's more to come. This is where you'll find stories that get even steamier, true dark romance. And because this version is getting so much more spicy, the video wouldn't be well received publicly on YouTube. This private space is where I can really show my true essence, and where I feel free to do my best work for you all. Keep in mind that the channel has been demonetized. So this is a way for me to keep my team together and continue bringing high-quality stories to you. I'll have even more updates for you soon. I'll be waiting for you at that first link in the pinned comment. Unfortunately, many people have been downloading our audio, effectively copying the entire story, and simply reposting it on YouTube. If you want to watch the original story and be the first to receive the next ones, search for My Stories by Lena on YouTube to get the best dark romance content. Remember, the official channel is My Stories by Lena on YouTube. I'll be waiting for you there.